Good morning. We have so much to talk about today. We're going to be focusing on the concepts of uh, co-located power or the unification process. The world that we live in has been in chaos, and we're now past the election, arguably of the decade, possibly of the generation. And having done that, we are now in that place of a sort of collective sigh where things seem to be evening out, stabilizing, becoming normalized. But before we get into our information for today, make sure you like and subscribe. Follow this channel on Twitch if you can. Subscribe, because therefore you don't have to watch any more commercials. And if you're on YouTube, definitely subscribe to help us make this a daily channel. And check out our Patreon account at patreon.com/Nykos. All right. So before we get into the individual pieces, I'm going to follow up on this concept of unified power. The idea that somehow if we collect our little power battery boxes, what do you want to call it, of energy, and we push them all in the same place, we'll get a greater output than we would individually. And this is certainly true in the case of anybody who's ever started an endeavor. When you've decided to make make the actual condition happen, there's been always that issue of getting yourself psyched up and getting ready to go, and then finally making the big push and heading off in a direction. And these embarking into areas of unknown has always been useful and effective for humanity. The concepts that I think, of course, are the ones that end in great tragedy. I mean, when you speak of the concept of the Tower of Babel, the way that chapter starts, it actually sounds pretty good. All mankind, everywhere, spoke the same language, understood one another perfectly, and embarked on this concept of reaching the heavens by construction. And you hear that and you think, yep, we can all work towards that singular goal. But the challenge is that if the goal isn't right, if the goal isn't appropriate, if the goal isn't really profitable or useful to us, the very effort will eventually run out of steam. The concept of, for example, the building of the tower was ill-advised because they hadn't consulted with the person to whom they were building. It would be like if you started building a bridge across a river and the guy on the other side of the river said, no, I don't want to connect, and isn't going to give you access, and he's not going to lift a finger to help. These kind of things always cause a problem. So we're going to be talking about the ways in which humanity's goals can become resonant. They become the focus, naturally lends itself towards unification, and we work towards those objectives instead of against them. So we're going to start off, ironically, with the governmental system that did establish in the world of Nykos eventually, and how that system of justice became a centralized power despite itself being sort of sacrifice. And maybe that's a Pyrrhic victory. Perhaps that's the danger of succeeding, is that you might succeed at something that isn't what you intended and still end up with the win in the win column, so to speak. But we'll start with that and figure out where we're going after that. If I recall correctly, after that we're going to be dealing with the concepts of culture. And then we're going to end with additional information on power in its actual outcomes and outer effects. So you wanted to probably stay to the end to catch the best, because somehow I've done it again. I've stacked these things in an inverse order. But all right, here we go. Okay, so at this point, we're going to do a repeat of an episode that I attempted on Monday when my microphone failed on me again. But this is just another day in quorum, or chord quorum. The city-state of Coram, nestled against the Wilderlands Mountains on the northern flanks of, pardon my no. I knew it was coming and I didn't get my sneeze button in time. I'll have to edit that later. Or leave it in just for comedy's sake. Who knows? It's people sneezing is a kind of a funny thing, I suppose. But if my nose starts running again, I'll have to do my pause or break and come back here. But the idea is that, no, let me restate. Coram, city-state, nestled against the northern flanks of the mountains north of Wilderlands and along the entire northern coast of Groenland, is a powerhouse in history and has been off and on for iterations. As is always the case in these Just Another Day episodes, I'm going to go through the effective history of this region and in particular of this city so that we keep a tap on what's going on in the world. Now, this country's name, Coram, has shown up many times in the adventures of my players as they have found instruments or artifacts or even denizens of this area and have endeavored to muddle their way through without actually visiting this kingdom. And at this point, it's fairly well advised to remain out of the actual Vale of Coram if you can absolutely help it because of the dangers of such a volatile area. And we will go into why this area is volatile as we go along. But it wasn't always this case. If we herald back, it is not a kingdom of the first or the second iteration, really. The Valley of Coram was at that time known as the Vale of Bones, and by the very nature of its rather disparaging and scary name, most of the adventuring groups that I had wouldn't even approach the Vale of Bones, and therefore were arguably well defended against the effects thereof. But in particular, the city-state that is now Coram comes into existence at the beginning of the third iteration and literally was at that point called Last Home. And it was fundamentally the place where the barbarian nations arose in terms of trade and identification. As Last Home, the unifying factor of the city-state was that it provided a safe haven when the winters got bad. As I mentioned, this is on the northern coast of Groenland, and during that iteration, this area was pretty much a snow-covered, snow-blasted plain, and fundamentally were the equivalent of high steps and simply were impenetrable during the deepest of winters and only barely passable in the best of seasons. The leadership of this area was by a series of vanquishing warlords, war chiefs, and the such that would hold the place under their control only as long as they could wrest it from the others, and then they would fall into obscurity and their antecedents would take them out and move in the area. But the region was fundamentally infested with, for lack of a better term, the Ordnung, an organization of it's actually a loose confederation of giant tribes, giantish beings, from the hill giants all the way up to the really scary ones. Ironically, the scariest ones lived on elegant floating palaces that drifted across Coram. Yes, I had seen the movie Zardoz, and if you haven't, put it on your list to watch, if only for a few minutes at the beginning, because it really is a truly intolerable film. But Zardoz is a floating palace where the rich and godlike beings held sway simply by their domination of the horizon line. And it's just, I have to admit, motion pictures are great influences, and you'll probably hear me over episode after episode describing how this motion picture or that motion picture may have affected me at the time. And this area also, if you can discern the idea here, the concept of the plains, the high step-like plains really affords itself kind of a Hyperborean feel, and therefore it was the homeland of the various barbarian tribes. And yes, that includes those that might have had a character by the name of Conan, or a god by the name Karam. There's many influences that can be seen and discovered in the world of Nycos if you A, study the maps, and B, read up on the backgrounds and the storylines of the various iterations. But in the third iteration, this High Plains was controlled by a warlord chieftain who, at times, he wasn't in charge, but at other times he was, by the name of Coram. And Coram was not a direct descendant, or it was not even directly affiliated with any particular player's enjoined person. Matter of fact, the concept of the injunction didn't come about yet for quite a long time. But the idea that this would have been a populated area and controlled by somebody who had been a PC would have been counterproductive for the way in which most of my game sessions ran, because the wild hordes from the north were ubiquitous. It's historically a trend, and I was as susceptible as any other. And so not only did the giants and barbarian hordes of humans, but also the original orc chieftains and stuff also came from the north, and most of them had spent at least some time in the Vale of the Vale of Bones, which is where Coram is. In that third iteration, humanity basically found itself bounded by chaos in all directions. The map wasn't yet fully developed, and it wasn't until the end of the third iteration that the map as we know it was finally formalized. At this point in time, the map of Groland was complete, and I was working on the other maps, hence the peninsula that you see off to the right there, heading towards what is now Omara, the city, the unconfederated unions of the barbarian tribes still maintain continuous control over the valley there, and therefore allow for the trickle of transit through Coram to occur, particularly along the forested northern reaches, which are sort of antithetical to the lifestyle of the plains barbarian. During the third iteration, as a matter of fact, at no point were the champions of the age ever anywhere near this area. They remained even south of the Wilderlands and operated fundamentally in the city of Turkun, which is a completely separate video that we'll be doing soon. As we move from the third age to the fourth age, humanity had gotten its grits, so to speak, and during the fourth iteration, humanity embarked on almost a quest-like desire to clear the Vale of Bones, because the pass through Coram was the shortest passway for passing through the Wilderlands. And while the the elf population of that iteration, they hadn't yet been renamed the Eldrin, the Wilderlands elf species known as the Altons, or I was not very clever back then. The High Elves were known as the Altons, and they possessed this area all along the Wilderlands mountain range. And as elves are wont to do, they were fairly isolationist, and so therefore passing through the Vale of Bones was more of, they were actually under more of a threat by interaction with and taxation by the Daean and Altan elves that lived in those mountains. Daea, D-A-E-A, was actually the name of one of their rulers, and eventually the Altan population lost their names in favor of being known as the Daean or Daean elves for a couple of reasons. One is that their handwriting was on the wall. They were the last of the Eldrin species. I did it again. I'm so used to calling them Eldrin now. The last of the Elvish people to maintain the city of Nyx, far to the west from here, by the way, that they therefore were sort of marked for death in the fourth and later iterations, simply because they had taken such a weird name. It was like the word Gaia, G-A-E-A, but they were instead Daea, D-A-E-A. And these Daean/Daean elves were pretty hostile, pretty wild, pretty uncaring, didn't have much to do with the surface dwellers down below. As a matter of fact, the concept of the half-elf, the Dungeons and Dragons equivalent now, is gone completely, but the original half-elves were, it was suggested that it was the mortals that were the bad guys in that structure, or that the concept of the elf who would sacrifice immortality to live with the mortals became so prolific and arguably profane that the Altons and, as a matter of fact, their more arrogant brethren, the Primus, both unilaterally decided to call the Eldrin who had been of questionable birth to be, were considered to be called Scorn, because that's literally the motif that their attitude about such beings came to be. And this concept, therefore, of the Scorn as a abandoned people also fed into some of the proto-Tolkienian viewpoints about the Numenorian peoples, that they were indeed long-lived, traveled much in the form and the style of other Eldrin species, but were arguably considering themselves above them and superior to them. And this led, therefore, to be a wide array of players who were playing characters who were basically displaced persons. And it was in this era the first use of the term murder hobos was tossed about long ago. But nonetheless, the adventuring groups that included the champions of the age, those who would eventually be the wielders of the powers of the prism, were included at least a couple of half-elves, and because of that very thing, the new adage that was added to the 6 champions was one there is that is not one. And initially it was because there was a a theoretical seventh piece of the prism that was supposedly going to be wielded by this person that had qualified to be pardon me. Pardon me. This person had qualified to be one of the heroes of the age, but did not become a wielder of one of these six weapons of power. And so the fourth iteration ended, I should say, in that fourth iteration, the power that grew to eventually clear out the Vale of Bones and establish the headlands for what is now Corum were the Dogs of War. And they tended to like to hunt in the area because the enemies were always sentient and still hyper aggressive. They weren't those people that like to be particular hunters, so they wouldn't necessarily pursue non-sentient creatures, no matter how plentiful they might be. But during this period, also dragons were fundamentally being hunted out of existence as well. So that by the time we get to the fifth iteration, there are no dragons exigent in the Wilderlands Mountains. There are no members of the Ordning operating in the plains of Corum either. However, they had been replaced with the half giant known as Golian, and the Golians expanded their territories until they were actually the equivalent of the Mongol hordes, if you will. They had become so numerous that they had basically dominated the area of the plains of Corum, and it wasn't called Corum back then, plains of Corum, and established the kingdom capital in this newly developing city-state. As such, they were considered to be, based on their longevity, more wise perhaps than their mortal brethren. And so the Golians eventually established the cathedrome as their primary equivalent of the supreme courts of the world, in that it was the final arbiter of justice. If you could not get justice in other nations or in other city-states, you could petition for a champion of Corum to take up your case and fight for you in the battlefields of the Cathedrome. And it became one of the greatest training centers for individual warriors the world over. As a matter of fact, Mercania, the kingdom known as the Sellsword Rialto, eventually would broker to send students to the Corumite legal system to get more even training on the very acts of defeating and destroying an opponent. And so during the fifth iteration, ironically, even as humanity and the cultures of the world were brought low by the failure of the champions to actually rise to their duties, nonetheless, these major cities who were primary fomenters of that fifth iteration rebellion were the places that made the most profit. Cities like Tenerife and Corum and Barbas all rose to prominence due to their sordid and criminal backgrounds, despite being vaunted as the enlightened cities of its age. And the darkest of lanterns became the brightest of lights during that dark period, ultimately culminating in the devastation at the city-state known as Haven. But that's a talk for a much later iteration as well, a much later episode as well. Needless to say, the rise of Corum in that period did establish their legal system. As a matter of fact, the very concept of combat by legates to determine the outcomes of justice became ubiquitous. And to this day, most of the courts in the world have Golian protectorates and Golian defenders working those cases. So it's unified and it's shared across the planet, and yet it's arguably one of the most sordid governmental systems at all. Now, in that fifth iteration, when it ended, the fall of the governmental system of the ordning caused the breakup of the unity of this nation, and eventually it fell back to wild steppes tribes, and again the predecessors of the Olmeran people spread out in this area and reclaimed it for the human population simply on the basis of their speed and the efficiency of the horse clans that they rode in that period. The concept of the Mongolian horse and rider, and the perhaps a hybrid with the why can't I remember their nation? I played them in Civilization all the time. Scythians. Between the Scythians and the Mongols, the horse and rider combinations soon took dominance over this whole region, and the rise of the horse clans were established and led to, again, in the sixth iteration in particular, the small population groups of free traders of Corum became almost synonymous with the wildlands everywhere, because they simply exited the Vale here and dominated it any place that they came to. Eventually, those descendants arrived in what is now Swarthir, and are the ancestors of the Swarthiri barbarians of today. During that sixth iteration, with that advance of the horse clans here, this boundary again became impassable, or nigh unto impassable, and the only saving graces with this also was the rise of the Jubilethans, and the safety of a Jubilethan caravan became watchword, and most people who traveled long distances would join themselves to one of the Jubilethan trains simply to protect themselves from the barbarian hordes. Eventually, as the sixth iteration passed on, the Olmeran peoples were finally established under Olmara, also known as Mama Roja, who established her kingdom by her efforts and diligence in maintaining and codifying the Corumite law. There still is to this day a Corumite court system, and generally it is moderated by the Golians, but as the Golians have once again gained acclaim in the ordning, they no longer consider humanity even their near brethren, and are gradually being bred out of existence as they recombine with the other giant-ish clans for name and propriety sake. When we get to the end of the seventh iteration, the main challenge is that the Cathedrome at Cord Corum, which had now taken on that name as their leader, was a seventh iteration champion who chose the path of godhood instead of remaining an accessible member of the why can't I remember names right this second? It cracks me up. The avatars of history. He chose instead the path to become a deity of law, and by developing this concept of legalese, governance, and religious fervor, the followers of Cord eventually established the the Torg Lord Kord of Kord to become their deity, as in his original server. Man, I am losing it in terms today. He had been a follower of the more ancient and more classic D&D realms god of Kord, but that was lost as he established himself in this kingdom and dedicated himself to become just as serious a deity as that. And so the Kordite movement within the Koromite religious community grew up and eventually established the Cathedrome as their chief temple. And now all of the religious personnel throughout the rest of the world, when they go to court, swear upon the threads of Kord, a document that he had created using a knotting technology similar to what is known to be the Inca people of South America here on terra firma. At any rate, the devastation, though, occurred shortly after that, when the champions of the Seventh Age took it upon themselves to attempt to undo the seeming misfortunes of history and attempted to eliminate forever the very concept of the iterations, and has tried to establish a centralized system that would reset the clocks back to session 0. Now, there's a fun piece of information about that we'll talk about in a later episode, but just know that the last of the Koromite governances, the last of their giantish leadership, fell away under the hands of Alma, the hands of Mamaroha and her people, basically decimating the giants of the region and stabilizing travel throughout the area. And that was on the direct heels of the Revening, the powerful magics released at the beginning of in the pre-8th iteration time frame. This magical effect created by the previous champions had completely eliminated all written works, and the libraries of Kordkorum, the libraries at Lexar, and a bunch of others were completely eliminated, book for book, page for page. And that devastation destroyed the overall superstructure of the Supreme Court systems of Quorum and threw the entire region into disarray and chaos for the entire period known as the Now. We'll talk about that more with another games group, and I'm going to hold off on going any farther into Quorum's past because the players are just getting ready to enter into these areas. And, oh, by the way, the Tuesday report is going to be absolutely wild for this week, so watch for that. So much good stuff is going on. So let's move on to our next section of today's show, shall we? Alrighty, we are now going to talk about a bit of game world building and game development. This segment is called The World in Around 80 Days, and it used to be a full extra episode, and I will still be parsing these episodes out individually on YouTube, but realize that The World in Around 80 Days is a world building concept we're in within a subjective period of around 80 days. I will be able to provide you with the tools to make an effective, useful, and dynamic fantasy realm for all of your stories to develop within. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of unifying the power of a community by developing its culture. Now we're going to talk about this in a couple of different ways, one of which is to speak, first of all, we have been using the bottom-up process using the nesting dolls and moving from the local community to a region, to a district, to a kingdom. And we are now starting to look at what it would mean if you have something has developed to the point of a kingdom in terms of theme. They've unified their worldviews within the framework. And so we need to now talk about how to take that to the next level, and that is to develop a culture. And when we talk about this, we need to talk about three primary things. We need to talk about your details, ambiance, and thematics. If you're going to make a culture memorable and useful, it has to be able to be easily identifiable. It needs to be unilaterally cultured, and to bear images and traditions and such that clearly define the theme. So, in essence, that's the rather crass term of whether the carpets match the drapes. I'm not going to go any further than that. But the idea here is that if your culture is, for example, let's pick a word. Well, my last name is Albin, so we'll go with the Albanese. If you're going to have the Albanese culture in the back streets, you need to have the Albanese cultures on the main drag and the central square, all the same. So how do we do that helps us to define what that locale has as its core values. We've talked before about the utilization of the CIS, or community identity sheet from NycosRPG. And while that is incredibly useful and could be used here, these tips are actually more in general for any fictional game system, whether it be for a game world or for novelization or whatever. But you want to make sure that you keep your community as a story element in character. In other words, if you're going to use a certain vocabulary, certain words need to be repeatable and understandable. It would be, for example, if you took the pirate culture, the concept of you must finish every sentence with R, every word you're going to spell is going to be spelled with an R, that these are in keeping with the theme and therefore in the character of this culture. Now, some would argue that this is stereotyping, and into a certain sake it is, but it's for mechanistic purposes. If you don't create a unifiable and recognizable culture, then it's awful hard for them to eventually become either the champions or the villains. If you think of the horror nature with which the Nazi culture developed, they became an enemy that was ubiquitous and identifiable wherever they were. And in the same fashion, you want to be able to speak that language of lore into your game sessions so that your players and or your readers know who to root for. If they were not so clearly defined, it would be hard to figure out in a given scene of conflict who you should back. And this gives a clear indication of that role. Now, that doesn't mean you're necessarily always building a bad guy culture. You might be building the Spartans or the equivalent, or the Trojans. And the idea here is that you're going to be building into the system manageable scene transitions, because you'll be able to clearly tell when the good guys are winning or when the bad guys are winning. Now, this also tends to lend itself on the more narrow theme of naming conventions and the things that the players discover. So, for example, if the players are the ones who pass through a certain region and they run into the first rhinoceros, they have not only they have the right, but they also have almost the duty and obligation to name and expand that knowledge of that name to other peoples. And by providing that as a mechanism, you give the idea of longevity and memorability to the player characters in your groups as well. And now when we talk about how we do this in the practical, the naming convention helps. So in other words, if you're in an area that is, historically Romanesque or Greek-esque than having male names end with an S and female names end with a vowel is historically accurate, and also happens to be able to foment the concept of the very culture you're trying to build. So whatever naming conventions you establish for the region, ensure that the players are aware of it and will adhere to it themselves in order to maintain that continuity. Even as they make discoveries, they're still going to be operating within the framework of that culture, and so therefore lean them into it. One of the biggest challenges, of course, is how do we get across descriptions of places without having to be completely expository in nature. And the easiest way to do that is to be descriptive rather than expositive. And what the nuance between those terms is that a description is generalized, expressing only localized terms for the things, and yet also leaving for the player's interpretation what those named things or named places are. So if you say this person is Aloysius from Exandria, well, the city names being of a feminine nature would be a female gender, would therefore make Alexandria a city, and this person, it must be a Greek citizen of that city, and so therefore it starts to feel like the same community without having to give great exposition on why the naming convention occurred. In that process, too, you want to allow the players to surprise you in terms of what they discover, so don't feel like you have to have created every species before you can start playing a role-play game. Your monsters and your beings will be named by the players by their interpretations of what they look and act like. So, for example, in Nykos, in the world that I run, players ran into a monstrous being north of the equator, so to speak, up in the temperate zones. They fought it to a standstill, and they thought that it might have trollkin blood, so they lit it on fire. But as they watched it burn, they realized it was actually using the heat of that fire to recombine, so that instead of having one of these monsters, they were developing 6 different ones, and realized that what they called a Nycosian troll was actually promoted in terms of growth by fire, not reduced or eliminated altogether, as would be the case of a standard troll who is susceptible to such. So you allow the players to find stuff out or determine to make changes on the fly, simply so the players have that moment of wonder and surprise. And permit that wonder, sometimes that wonder about things, to actually drive the storyline. Not all the time. It would be completely capricious and insane to let the concepts of capriciousness run amok. But every once in a while, let the direction of the player's course drive the story, so that their discoveries and the wonder that they get to experience is translated and makes the game particularly fun for you. The gist of the matter is that once you've done these things and considered all these ideas of what culture is, you can start to narrow and define what the culture you're trying to place in a particular locale will be. And perhaps it's a nomadic one, and therefore it might be more than one location. Or it may be localized in cities, but expressed among the commoners as well. So by building a concept of what that culture is, one culture at a time, we're growing the world that many more steps close to completing the world in around 80 days. Alrighty, now we're going to jump into the Game Master's soapbox. And in this section, I want to talk about something I find very effective, and that is finding ways to empower your players in your game session. Because when you do so, you take the burden off of yourself to handle the story development and make the game, if nothing else, at least feel more under the control of the player. You see, the balance of power is not between governments and governance. Those can be at war for decades or even centuries without any kind of an outcome, really, because the economics of warfare tend to be pretty close to onerous. But the advantage that the players can have in a campaign and the ability for them to become the deal makers and king namers just simply increases over time. So just realize that the balance of power is actually at the tabletop within the PCs and their non-enjoined equivalences. They have the ability to wage war, to prevent war, etc., etc. And this powerhouse is actually defined more closely as the personalities of the players, because it's their choice and their will that will ultimately provide the triggering force for any of those kind of decisions. So for this sake, what we want to do is talk about the first thing we have to realize is that in an early story with new players, the game master's storyboarding and railroading of the players can be essential for them to start to develop their own ideas and their own mechanisms. But the empowering of the players is going to start with disconnecting the story's locomotive. Whatever it was that was driving the players to this point needs to become obviated. Either it's eliminated because they ran out of whatever it was, or they've abandoned that location for another and no longer have resource. The idea of disconnecting the engine, and those of you that are from Nikos already know where I'm going on this, but the establishment of these items as reliquaries or trigger points certainly can remain, but they have to be disconnected as the story drivers for the stories to become unique and player-driven. And the reason to do this is that there is an increasing power that the players develop when they actually have the tools and the knowledge and the skill level, not to mention, in the case of Dungeons & Dragons, the ridiculously large pool of hit points that allows them to start to develop the power of restraint, that they literally choose to not get involved in things and thereby become the essential kingmakers. The disconnection of that power source, therefore, is critical, because the players have to have already brought themselves to the point of understanding what that restraint means in order to understand how really effective they can be at changing the world. And I think that's one of the elements, if I had to point to it, one of the key elements of role-playing games is the ability to change the world. In modern stories and in historical stories, players very rarely have any influence on the overall story unless it's a fabrication, because we as human beings want there to be a way to change our world. And so therefore, in a fantasy setting, they certainly can, because they have the power to. It's just a matter of them learning from their mistakes. And this is critical for a game master with a games group who is finally being cut loose, is you have to allow them to make mistakes. Perhaps they back a non-winner. Perhaps they get thwarted by somebody who knows more than they do. All of these elements should be there not to undermine or destroy the player's will, but instead to give them chances to build up their abilities. And only way we really learn is by making mistakes. Now that means that you as a storyteller really need to develop the skills of situational scale. How many people is a mob? How much of a mob is inexorable? And how do you keep the players from being summarily executed by a group that don't agree with them? Because you have to realize and expect that every group that you play will eventually fail badly at least once in a while. So you have to play like a thinker and think like a player, because you have to find ways to justify and explain the course of the adventures in such a way that it's not perceived that you are cheating the system. And I'll flat out state that if you as a game master have to cheat to get things to be accomplished in your story, you might be doing something wrong. Because if you've built the engine properly, when it comes to those die rolls, you won't have to make them. Also realize that you need to give time and effort to players as they succeed in order to celebrate their wins, so that it won't go to their heads. They need to understand the great respect and great honor that they earn by doing the right thing, and feed those successful encounters with plenty of rewards so that they see the overall value of them. But of course, beyond all of this, you have to make sure you maximize the fun in all game aspects. If a player isn't having fun, the game master is going to have a problem in the short term or in the long term. So it's better to try to maximize the fun for everybody at all levels throughout this process. Even as you're empowering your players, you have to realize that they also are human beings as well. All right, we've come to the end of the matter, and this is my last show for the week. In theory, we may be on tomorrow, but that's still up in the air at this point. We have some major notifications coming out next week on Tuesday, which is Nycos Newsday, so watch out for those. When it comes to power and the consolidation of power, when we look at it in the meta of our world, in North America, in the United States in particular, there is an election process, and the position of who's sitting in the presidential chair is decided by a process that is time-honored over 4 generations now. If you count them 50 years, no, we're talking 30 years, so a dozen. The whole point is that I'm trying to do the math in my head, and it's not working this early in the morning. The process that brought us to where we are is the ebb and flow of culture. And while the nation of the United States is large enough to represent many dozens of cultures, the unifying field theory, if you will, of the American culture is the concept of the right to vote, the right to choose your electors who turn around and make the choices for you. And I'm glad that this is in a situation of a peaceful transfer of power. The alternative would have been pretty much a death knell for the country. But I don't know, really, if you look at my orange and black markers moving up and down, liberty and happiness, that's what these represent. And the idea that we have to be liberal, or we can be happy, or we can be liberal, is a mixed bag, because the reality is that we all are afforded the same liberties, and we only rise to the pursuit of happiness. And so therefore that in itself is a work ethic, and one which I personally embrace. So the end of the matter is unifying your cultural leadership, unifying your national leadership, unifying your personal disciplines. All are echoes of the same thing, and that is the concept of balance, of uniformity, of sharing the highlights and lowlights, and embracing who ye are as people. This really needs to be the message. And one of the reasons why I'm so ardent about gameplay in general and roleplay in specifics is these are the ways in which we share with others these very balancing tools that are going to be necessary to help us into the upcoming age of leisure. I've mentioned it before. I still call it the leisure economy that we're heading into, because the ability to afford what we love to do on the whatever restricted budget we have is going to be the measure of how we as a culture survive beyond the end of the industrial era. So, having said all of that and pontificated, I'm now going to get off my soapbox, and we're going to go on with the rest of our day. I want to thank you for being here. If you like what you've seen, bless you, and follow us subscribe. If you didn't like what you've seen, thank you for the time that you've invested. I greatly appreciate that you were here at least, and I hope to see you in the next episode of the Game Master's Guide. And I will see you all later.